the people at these protests are actually just puppets. They're just pawns. They don't actually even know why they're there. Evidence, of course, by their own words, but really, philosophically, they don't even know why they're at these protests. These protests are not grassroots. They're not organic. They are staged and they are funded. And I'm going to tell you exactly who is behind these protests. So these protests, the No Kings protests, are organized by a group called Indivisible. This group is a leftist activist group, and it was founded by a couple. You know, actually, if you look up the group Indivisible, it's often described as being founded by two former congressional staffers. And what is neglected, information that's neglected, is that these people are married. This woman and this man, they're a couple. They're married. Their names are Leah, Greenberg, and Ezra, Levin. And yes, they did formerly work as congressional staffers. They also worked at the State Department. They're former State Department employees who specialize in color revolutions, which is a critical piece of this because there's a video of them discussing choosing the colors for the next color revolution, ostensibly the color revolution that they're trying to stage domestically. Take a look at this video.
Kathy asked a question that is a hot topic of debate internally, Leah. We need a national symbol of unity to stand against authoritarianism or for pro-democracy. I'm interested in using purple bandanas. It's not about being red or blue. It's about standing in solidarity with each other for our democracy. How can we as a group come up with something we can stand behind? So we have had this conversation internally and with a lot of the No Kings Coalition and other folks. And we're circling around an idea that, Leah, we're not allowed to fully announce anything yet.
Well, I mean, so we're actually, I would just say, we agree this is a gap. And one of the things we're tracking and trying to figure out is like, what's getting organic pickup that we can start to pull out and capitalize on, right? And so thinking about things that we're seeing pop on the internet, things that we're seeing start to like take off in places like Reddit. The color yellow and black have come up a lot, which is obviously very like, you know, kind of people taking pieces of the No Kings logo and running with it as a color scheme. We agree this is like a need. And what we really want to do is try to figure out like what's already starting to organically take off that we can collectively come in together on. But we hear you and we think this is something that we're very much thinking about right now.
We had a whole hour-long meeting with folks. Was it yesterday, Leah? Just on this specifically. So it's one of the challenges, and it's something that we discussed, is when you try to seed something like this, when you try to grow something like this, you start with an idea, and we can all you can debate it should be purple, it should be yellow, it should be green, whatever it is. And one challenge is settling on what that idea is that you want to push, and then you've got this period in between when you've settled on the idea and when you actually make that a cultural phenomenon. And in the in-between period, what you need is a lot of people who say, screw it, I'm just going to do it. I'm going to be one of the first movers out there who's just, I'm all in yellow, or I've got my yellow bandana, or it's, whatever it is. And we're going to need a lot of people who do that. So this group, once we have something, we are going to be asking all of y'all to help be the first movers on this, to make the thing a thing. Hopefully we'll be ready to come back here soon and try to push on something like that.
That was Ezra Levin and Leah Greenberg, the couple that founded the group Indivisible. Indivisible is the group that staged, that coordinated, that planned, that mobilized the No Kings protest. You heard them describing a color revolution. They are former State Department employees who are experts in color revolution, and they were specifically describing picking colors, as you do for a color revolution, for not just the next protest, but for No Kings Day specifically. They said some people are talking about yellow and black. Well, that's what you saw out in the streets. You saw a bunch of old people with like toddler tiaras on wearing yellow and black because that's what they decided was the color of their color revolution. Again, the point of all of this, it might be obvious at this point, this wasn't a grassroots organic event. This was a highly staged, funded, coordinated event. And by the way, there were U.S. aid employees that were reportedly handing out posters. In New York City, the No Kings organization partnered with the local Communist Party. This was a highly coordinated, lots of left-wing groups were involved. And you can look up more information about those groups. I want to stay with Indivisible for a second because I think the crux of what the group Indivisible is and who they get their funding from and why the person that funds them gives money for this cause is extremely important. So Indivisible gets, I would say, the majority of their money. Their last tax return showed a little bit more than half of their money coming directly from George Soros and his Open Societies Foundation. Now, you know, we've spent the last probably 2 months on this show talking about Roy Singham. And what's interesting about protests that are funded by Roy Singham versus protests that are funded by George Soros is oftentimes the protests that are funded by Roy Singham aren't really protests. They're riots, they're violence, they're agitation. And it's intended to be so, whether it's the violent anti-ICE riots, whether it's the Students for Justice in Palestine, the pro-Hamas stuff, whether it's the radical pro-trans militant groups. Roy Singham is an open communist, and what he funds in our country, the groups, the riots, are violent. George Soros, on the other hand, you're probably more familiar with his name. We all have been familiar with his name for a couple of decades now, probably since before I was born. He's been one of the biggest Democrat donors for decades, yet his events, or the events that he funds, the groups that mobilize and plan those events, they're not quite as violent initially as Roy Singham funded protests, but they are equally as destructive. Here's what I mean. So on this show, or actually behind the scenes on the show, we've been having discussions for a while about identifying George Soros' ideology. Because when you think of George Soros, you think globalist, which is accurate. You think open borders, which is accurate. But that actually doesn't describe what he believes. He's been somewhat reticent to admit publicly what his beliefs are. And so some people will be like, oh, he's a communist, he's a Marxist, he's a socialist. Well, not exactly. He's not. In a sense, it would be easier if he were, because it would be easier to define and identify the various parts of his ideology and his work, but he's not. So what is he? Because globalism and open borders, that's not really an end. That's a means to an end. So what is he trying to achieve and why? So what we did is we did a little bit of a deep dive into George Soros's background. We're going to have Mike Benz on the show here in just a moment. I'm just teeing this all up for Mike. And he's going to describe to us what motivates George Soros. But I want to bring to your attention something that I read. George Soros, back in 2003, wrote this is actually a transcript of a talk he gave called America's Global Rule. And it was essentially a criticism, a critique of the George Bush administration on every level, but especially about the Iraq War. And what's funny is you and I actually agree with George Soros now about Bush's mishandling of the Iraq War, just for very different reasons. Soros didn't like how Bush was handling the Iraq War for very different reasons than you and I disagree with how Bush handled the Iraq War. But in this piece that George Soros, it was a speech he gave that he turned into an essay. It's posted on his website called America's Global Role. There are a couple of quotes. He's describing his worldview. He's describing what it means to support open societies. And this is what he writes. And I quote, "In an open society, people can decide for themselves what they mean by freedom and democracy." He goes on to say, but the Bush administration claims that we have discovered the ultimate truth. People can decide for themselves what they mean about freedom and democracy. So what he's proposing is that an open society, it actually doesn't have to do with open borders. That's not what he's describing. He's describing a society where there is no objective truth that's recognized by the government or by the people, by civil society. He's describing a relativistic society. He goes on to quote his inspiration for the phrase open society. He says, "Because open society is an abstract idea, I shall proceed from the abstract and general to the concrete and particular. The concept of open society," George Soros writes, "was developed by philosopher Karl R. Popper, whose book, Open Society and Its Enemies, argued that totalitarian ideologies, such as communism and fascism, posed a threat to an open society because they claimed to have found the final solution. The ultimate truth," Soros writes, "is beyond human reach. Those who say they are in possession of it are making a false claim, and they can enforce it only by coercion and repression." So Popper derived the principles of freedom and democracy, the same principles that President Bush championed in his February speech on Iraq, from the recognition that we may be wrong. End quote. So Soros, again, is saying that there is no such thing as truth, that anybody who claims that they are in possession of the truth are lying, and the only way to make that truth accepted is by coercion and repression. He goes on to talk about how you transform a society that recognizes truth into a so-called open society. He says, quote, "A world order based on the sovereignty of states, moreover, cannot take care of our common human interests. The main source of poverty and misery in the world today is bad government, repressive, corrupt regimes, and failed states. And yet, It is difficult to intervene in the internal affairs of other countries because the principle of sovereignty stands in the way, end quote. So he, of course, presents this as if he is a humanitarian. He presents this in an altruistic way, as if he wants to solve poverty and, help countries who have been repressed by a corrupt government. But the takeaway from that paragraph shouldn't actually be his misconstruing his own interests in meddling in foreign countries, which are probably to profit himself, which we'll get to in a moment. No, the takeaway from that sentence is that he doesn't believe in sovereignty. He doesn't want nations to be sovereign, because sovereignty, what does sovereignty do? Sovereignty protects the institutions, the norms, and the traditions on which a culture, a civil society is based. So if you wanted to destroy the institutions, the norms, and the traditions, which are based on objective truth and not relativism, you would maybe open a border to destroy the sovereignty of that state. And suddenly, George Soros' ideology becomes a little bit clearer to me than it was, say, a week ago. And I was like, what does he believe? Why does he want globalism? Why does he want open borders? Like, obviously he's a leftist. He gives a radical leftist causes. It's not that he's somewhere. It's not that his ideology is nebulous, but what drives it? Well, he doesn't believe in objective truth. So he encourages the redefinition of terms, your truth, my truth. He wants to destroy sovereignty to make that happen, because if you destroy sovereignty, it destroys culture. Culture is how we collectively as people protect truth. In addition, of course, to his stupid globalism stuff. He doesn't want America to make our own decisions. And we're going to talk to Mike Benz about that aspect of it, the economic aspect of it. But the root of all this, what is the root of all this? Well, the root of all this, George Soros actually did admit at one point. In 1998, he did an interview with 60 Minutes. And you can find this here and there. It's not widely disseminated anymore. But in 1998, George Soros was asked whether he was religious himself or whether he believes in God. And this was George Soros's answer. Take a listen.
Are you religious?
No.
Do you believe in God?
No.
Soros told us he believes God was created by man, not the other way around, which may be why he thinks he can smooth out the world's imperfections.
Are you religious? He was asked. No, he replied. Do you believe in God? He was asked. No, he replied. He believes that God was created by man and not the other way around. So, not to sound preachy here, not to sound religious, but George Soros' hatred of the United States and our norms and our traditions and our sovereignty is based on hatred of the foundational principles on which our country was built, that of God and Christianity. And isn't this always the case? It's always a hatred of God that motivates them. That's why they killed Charlie. That's why they're blinded by hatred of Trump, even though they can't describe it when they're asked. Because no, he's not terribly religious. Trump's not terribly religious, but he defends truth. Not truth he defines, truth that is objective. That's why they want to destroy all definitions of objective reality, because that is written by God. That's natural law. That's why they're seething with hatred at the United States, because we're built as a Christian nation to allow us to glorify God. That's why they want to dehumanize us, because we are made in the image of God. That's why they want to kill. That's why they want to kill more. Look at the attendees who turned out to this No Kings protest. Attendees who are dressed as Charlie Kirk's assassin, who mind shooting someone in the neck. Threats against the life of Stephen Miller and his family. We have video of protesters fantasizing about guillotining Trump. This is not normal. This is not political division. This is evil. These people have chosen darkness, because you can try to separate politics and religion, and we've tried that a lot in our country, but it will fail because you can't. Ultimately, it's always about God. It's always about God.